Hi, I'm Scott Houston, and welcome to another broadcast of Learning with Power. And today we're going to do what I'm going to call History of the World Part 2. Partly because I've sort of already done a History of the World in the Rule of Evolution series. And so this is sort of an extension of the Rule of Evolution series. So you could say this is like Part 5 of that or something if you want, except I'm not talking about evolution really anymore. But also because the History of the World Part 1 has already been done by Mel Brooks, you know.
Behold the 10 commandments.
Anyway, so this is History of the World Part 2. All right. Now, one thing that I want to get to is somebody did mention about one of my TikTok videos about the life experience and the life demonstration, and he says, well, you know, mold is not a one-celled organism, it's a polycelled organism. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I mean, I can't really show you one-celled organisms, you know, in this format. You know, we need a microscope, and you'd have to look under the microscope, and you know. So the point that I was trying to make is just that given the right conditions, you know, the right atmosphere and the right amount of oxygen and etc., and the right temperatures, life just happens. It's just a natural phenomenon. Just like if you put Mentos in Diet Coke, it'll explode out of the bottle or whatever. It'll do it every time. It's just what happens given those conditions. That's how science works. And so I just think it's a natural phenomenon, and the best way to illustrate that or to demonstrate that was the way that I did it with mold. Like I said, one cell bacteria's that forming, I can't show you that in this format, and I can't show you because we don't have a microscope, mainly is the reason. Okay, so moving on, let's pick up where the history, or the History of the World Part 1, but the Rule of Evolution of Part 4 left off, and we're talking about basically Neanderthals. Now, Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Denisovans are the primary ones that were still around within the last 100,000 years, and they are apparently now called archaic humans, because they're so similar to humans, but they weren't quite humans. So they're now called archaic humans. I was just calling them all hominids. And they did apparently indeed crossbreed, as I suggested that there were, and there were half-breeds that they have found. They found some in Israel, they found some in Eastern Europe, in Romania, and both of these the locations are about 40,000 years old. And so it was clear that that was happening, and in fact, according to DNA, they can find that, you know, all Europeans and in fact most all Asians as well have some percentage of Neanderthal in their DNA. More for like Caucasian Europeans, but also even Eastern Asians have some DNA of Neanderthal. Not Aboriginals, though. Not Aboriginals. Aboriginals don't. They are totally human, and apparently they have the oldest DNA. And so other areas that had old DNA is like they have Morocco has DNA that goes back to 300,000 years ago, and Ethiopia has DNA that goes only back to 195,000 years ago. And then there's an area in I think Cameroon that's got very old DNA. But there's what they call different hotspots, and they think that there's like different places within Africa. Now, this is the current school of thought where humans evolved. Well, if there's different hotspots in Africa, what I'm saying is, why can't there be different hotspots internationally? You know, why, how about Southeast Asia? Why couldn't that be a hotspot? I mean, they have primates and orangutans in Borneo, and they found Homo erectus in Java, obviously, which is like part of Indonesia. And they found Denisovans apparently in Papua New Guinea, as well as up in the Ural Mountains up in Russia. So, because if there's no evidence of Neanderthals being in Africa whatsoever, if nobody in Africa has African or has Neanderthal DNA, I think it's because the Neanderthals never went into Africa. And there's probably two reasons for that. For one, I think that they were fighting with the Homo sapiens, and they just decided not to go into Africa at all. But also, I think it's because they did not come from Africa. Because we can trace DNA back to like 300,000 or 250,000 years ago within Africa, but nobody has any Neanderthal DNA. So if Neanderthals started in Africa and they were a late emerging archaic human, I don't think that's possible that they could have been in Africa. You know, how did they migrate? Did they migrate out before 200 or 300 years ago as like chimpanzees or something like that and then evolve? You know, it doesn't make any sense. So I think what is logical is that they evolved somewhere else, maybe in Southeast Asia, and they migrated across, you know, all throughout Eurasia, and did not go down into Africa. And Homo sapiens came from Africa and went out into Europe and Asia, and they interbred with obviously with Neanderthals, because it's the only way that we could have Neanderthal DNA. That had to have happened, and so. For one reason, Neanderthals apparently are not very, they're discovering recently, were not very sociable. They were not even sociable with each other. And so I don't think that they were really very sociable with the Homo sapiens. I think the Homo sapiens sort of took it upon themselves to interact with the Neanderthals that were there and to mate or whatever, to interbreed. But I don't think it's something that the Neanderthals were seeking out. The Homo sapiens are very, very sociable. And it's these social networks that helped them to grow. And as these social networks grew and got larger, and they started having common language and common religion, yes, before civilization, yes, religion, that's right, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. They were developing these networks and developing basically not just larger groups of tribes, but also just larger networks, you know, and as their networks got larger, it's something that Neanderthals just couldn't compete with, because there just wasn't that many Neanderthals. And eventually they were either beaten in war or battles, but mostly they were probably, or they died off because of not having as much, because of not being as diverse of a gene pool, like as I discussed before, they died off from disease, or also they were just incorporated into the general population, which seems apparent since Europeans all have Neanderthal DNA, and quite a bit of Neanderthal DNA in some cases, sometimes as much as like 4 or 5%. And we also think that the more Neanderthal DNA that you have, you might, it actually seems to make you more impervious to certain types of diseases that they're coming around nowadays. And that it actually made you more resistant to like plague and things like that. So it was the combination, you know, that you know, made it stronger. And so what you have now is, okay, let's talk about all that. Just making sure. Okay, so what I'm talking about in this episode mainly is what happened after the Neanderthals and after the Denisovans as well. And so we're talking about 40,000 years ago. Now, about 40,000 years ago, like I said, we've got some these hybrids that we've discovered, samples of hybrids, but also pretty much by that time, Neanderthals and Denisovans were no longer, and they were all absorbed within the human, you know, rather than archaic human, but the modern day human like we have today, populations. So we're starting around 40,000 years ago. And so you take the world 40,000 years ago, And you're like, okay, so what were people like 40,000 years ago? And the answer is, well, they were a lot like us. I mean, they were intelligent, they were athletic, they grew to be 6 feet tall, they lived 90 years, you know, with good luck. They were just like they were humans. And so not a lot really is discussed about this period of time. So I'm talking about the period of time from when humans dominated the world, which is about 40,000 years ago, up to when civilization started, which is around 10,000 BC, or let's say 12,000 years ago. So that's a period of about 28,000 years, for which there's hardly any textbooks, hardly anything that's written about this at all. There's not any documentaries that I could find. There's been some popular novels and things that were set during this time period, which is called the time period, or the period of time of the hunter-gatherers. That's what they were called at the time, the hunter-gatherer period. So like Planet of Cave Bear and things like that were set in this time period. But basically, there's not a lot that's talked about, you know, because it's prehistory. So we don't really have a lot of knowledge about what happened. We just can see from finding old campsites and things like that to determine, you know, exactly what happened. Okay, so what did humans have about 40,000 years ago? Okay, so about 40,000 years ago now, you've got. The other thing I wanted to point out was that also, what really led to the migration of early man was looking for, because they were hunter-gatherers, mostly what they ate was meat. And with meat they got a lot of protein, and they grew larger and stronger, and they had a lot more energy, and they had a lot more vitamins too. And if you look at Chinese today, you can see the difference between having meat and not having meat. When I first went to China, everybody was pretty small, and then when I went back to China, everybody was like 6 feet tall, or not everybody, but there was a lot of people who were a lot taller, much more normal size, more like Europeans. And the difference is, you know, McDonald's basically was the difference. They started eating meat, whereas before that they hadn't. And this was the advantage that the Mongolians had, which is why they built the wall, to keep the Mongolians out, because the Mongolians were much bigger than the general Chinese, because Chinese were eating a lot of vegetables, and the Mongolians, they were not settled down and building civilizations and growing things. They were just still eating meat, and so they were growing much bigger and stronger, and so actually that gave them an advantage. And this was true in early cultures as well. So, you know, the first people that attempted to grow things and to just eat that sort of thing, they had a lot of growing pains to go through, as well as dealing with the fact that anybody who might oppose them, who lived around them, would have a huge advantage as far as attacking them and overpowering them. So what did exist? Okay, so about one of the first things that we've noticed that man, whether it be archaic man or modern man, developed was fire and cooking food. And we can see some dramatic changes that happened within the teeth of humans after about 150,000 years ago. And so that was really the first thing that man, the first innovation that like all men in general learned to do. And actually the next thing that it seems like they developed was clothing. And so we start seeing some, you know, fairly sophisticated clothing and stitching and things like that as early as like 100,000 years ago. And Neanderthals made cloth as well, and so did Denisovans. And in fact, just recently they found a needle, a wooden, clearly a needle, or I think it's made out of bone, needle that was made for making cloth. That the Denisovans used. So Denisovans did it, and Neanderthals, and we can assume all archaic humans made clothing. And that was already happening well before 40,000 years ago. They were already wearing clothing. But some of the things that happened soon thereafter, after you had the mixing of the cultures, and you had culture was sort of growing, is you have about 30,000 years ago in Eastern Europe, they find the oldest artwork. And so what started happening is that they started, because they have had larger communities, and they were collectivizing and putting their efforts together instead of just small groups like Neanderthals traveled in. They traveled in larger groups. Now they might have had a group of thousands or something. And so collectively, not everybody had to work as hard. So some people were able to make artwork. So we can find artwork that's as early as 30,000 years ago in Eastern Europe. And the other thing that seems to have happened around 30,000 years ago is we started to domesticate animals, especially pets, like dogs. So there's clear evidence of domesticating dogs about 30,000 years ago. And so those are some of the things that happened early on. Bowls, we find the earliest evidence of bowls around 20,000 years ago, but that's in China. And to be honest with you, the area in southeast China, like I said, was almost like a paradise. And so it was more reason for them to settle down. And that's why civilization evolved there. But we're finding evidence of bowls about 20,000 years ago. So the reason we don't really find a lot of artifacts that like bowls and things, even something as common as that, is because, if you're being hunters and gatherers and you're on the move a lot, you don't want to have a whole lot of stuff that you got to carry with you. And so they weren't really inclined to make a lot of stuff. And it was hard enough for the women just to carry their toddler along with them, as they were trekking through the wilderness. And so you don't see a lot of that sort of thing. So, but around 20,000 years ago, you see bowls, and we see clear evidence of trade happening around 19,000 years ago. So it seems like 30,000 years ago they start doing artwork, and then 20,000 years ago they start making some bowls, and then about 19,000 years ago we see clear evidence of trade. And even as early as 40,000 years ago, we see evidence of trading seashells, and almost like using seashells as currency. Also, the small glass beads that came from basically the Indus Valley region. But 19,000 years ago, we see clear evidence of them trading, which means that obviously at some point somebody came up with some sort of system of counting, because you can't really trade unless you can count. I'll give you buh of these things for buh of these things. I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever their number was in their language, had to, you had to develop counting. And so we're emerging a little bit, we're developing a little bit of technology. Clothing about 20,000 years ago seems to be a lot more sophisticated. Like I said, now it's like cloth and even dyed cloth and stuff from maybe 15,000 years ago. Which is a lot more sophisticated than what they had 40,000 years ago. And so these innovations that are being made were basically passed down by the elders, and were passed down at the campfires by storytelling. And so everybody, when they finished their day, would gather around the campfire, and the children or whatever would sit around, and the elders would tell stories about the ancestors and legendary tales about what happened with the ancestors. And this really was the foundation or the beginning of religion. And so some of the things that they would tell would be things like, would be passing along a technology, like how to make cloth, or how to make fires, or how to make spears, and bow and arrows. That was around 70,000 years ago. And it seems that humans developed bows and arrows, but doesn't seem like Neanderthals developed bows and arrows, which of course gave humans a big advantage, not only for catching animals, but in warfare, if they had warfare. But and it wasn't just a bow and arrow. Eventually they had this thing where it was like a slingshot. It was like they would hold this thing, it would come back, it was fold back, and then it would hold the arrow like this with the spear. It was that was the first type of bow and arrow that they used. And they would throw that, and they could get a lot more power with that. That seemed to be the first evolution of that, and then eventually they actually came up with a bow and arrow sort of thing. But it seems like Neanderthals didn't really do that. But all archaic humans, it seems, did develop like arrowheads. So either they were tips for arrows or they were tips for spears. So they were spear tips, or they had the type of spear that they would throw like this. It would open up and thrust the spear with more power. So that seems to be something that happened too. But the elders would sit around and they would explain all this at the campfire. And so this was also the beginning of religion. And so a lot of people say, oh, well, religion began once we had civilization. I think that's a bunch of crap. Religion began almost from the outset. And basically, because religion basically is an explanation for anything that humans collectively did not understand. So when little Junior would say, Daddy, why is the water blue? The answer was, God. Just like it is today. For anything that humans cannot seem to understand, the answer is always God. Well, why is it like this? Well, God. Why did that happen? Well, God. Well, why does this happen? Well, God. Why do earthquakes happen? God. Why does a tornado happen? God. Why does rain happen? God. And so you have religion, I'm certain, from the very beginning, from 100,000 years ago, I'm sure they had religion, which is why all of the very first evidence of civilization that we find are things that are built to honor gods of some kind, some religious sort of monument. All of it is that's what we find. And so religion was a very important part of early civilizations, and it was also a bonding and linking thing. It was a uniting force. So not just language, but also religion united larger and larger groups of people. And so that's one of the phenomenons that happened. But basically, what hunters and gatherers did was they ate a lot of meat. And they traveled around looking for meat. And this was not a difficult lifestyle. There was plenty of big game. And in fact, there was a lot more big game, actually, in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I really think that the reason why sub-Saharan Africans look different and also don't seem to have a lot of the DNA that let's say, Middle Eastern and Europeans or Asians have, is because they did not necessarily migrate. And I think it's because they didn't really need to, because they had a lot of big game for a longer period of time and into more modern times than the rest of the world did. And so they didn't really have a need to go beyond the Sahara Desert, which at times was more green, but then there was also times when it was covering all the way into Ethiopia and all the way across into Morocco, and it just was impenetrable. There were large periods of time where you just couldn't get past that. It was a big barrier that was keeping people from going across that. So I think most of the people that came out of Africa and migrated and eventually went into Australia, things like that, probably came from like Ethiopia or Northern Africa, even Morocco. So this is before the Middle Easterns got there and it became Muslim. Before that, they were basically black, and they migrated across from that way. But they came from like Ethiopia, maybe Eritrea, Somalia, that area, basically the Horn of Africa, and they migrated up through that way, into the Levant and out that way. But I don't think it was sub-Saharan Africans so much. I don't really see evidence of them migrating. I see evidence of humans migrating out of Africa, but not coming from the southern part of Africa. So what happened was, in the northern part of Africa, eventually, you've got all the big beasts start dying out. And more so in certain areas rather than other areas, and a lot of that had to do with climate changes that happen naturally. And so basically that gave rise to like the need to try to create and cultivate food and create food in some other ways. And so one of the things that they developed was better hunting techniques. And so they started developing enclosures and making actually fences and things like that, and running animals into enclosures and things like that, making them easier to capture and stuff. But eventually somebody said, well, why don't we just, domesticate the animals and just have them in enclosures and raise them and breed them and things like that, and why don't we grow our own food and things like that. And so that was really the beginning of civilization as we know it. And where it seems like that happened first was actually in southern Turkey. And so even though they talk about Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, it seems like really the very first civilizations were like in southern Turkey, which is really the foundation of religion as well, or the birthplace for modern religion anyway. But there's communities there that are, like I said, about 12,000 years old that were doing farming. And now initially the idea of settling down, so once you plant seeds, you have to hang around and wait for these things to grow so you can cultivate them. And so it made people settle down. And then so you had large groups of people, you had large networks of people, and they're all settling down. So instantly you've got this community of like a couple thousand people all settling down, and you're growing things, and you're working collectively, and you've got a common language, and you've got a common religion, and you've got a common objective, which is to grow food and to domesticate animals. But also they had a huge advantage because they had things like wheat and cultivatable type plants that they could easily cultivate early on, and as well as domestic type of animals that they could easily domesticate, whereas like in sub-Saharan Africa they had a lot of big game, but they weren't very good for domesticating. You know, it's hard to domesticate a zebra or a lion, you know. But it was easier to domesticate goats and sheep, and those kinds of things grew around the area, or evolved or existed in the area around the Levant and places like that. And so that began early civilization. But early on it was difficult. I mean, it was hard work. We see evidence of people like their bones are fused together. They had terrible arthritis because of working and plowing and toiling every day. So rather than just walking around the countryside, they're toiling every day, and they're eating a lot more fiber and a lot more seed. So early man needed a lot of high protein. But now we're not getting as much protein, and we're not taking in as many calories. And so we're growing smaller. Our teeth are rotting a lot easier, and it was hard work. And so initially it wasn't so obvious that there were benefits to settling down, which is why it took 28,000 years basically, which is why, you know, we kept putting it off more or less, because it was a lot easier as long as there was big game to walk around and then wander around and kill big game. But once that big game started to dry up and you couldn't really find it anymore, I think that was what was the impetus to force people into civilization. And like I said, initially the benefits were not clear, and it was very hard. And so, and it was not obvious. So, but what it did though is, by settling down, now they were able to have more children. So when you're a hunter and gatherer and you're just, you know, you're carrying a toddler with you, you can't have one kid after the other after the other after the other. It just doesn't really work with that type of a lifestyle. But if you're going to settle down, you're going to start to build things and build enclosures and domesticate things and build buildings and religious monuments and things like that. Now you have a lot more reason to just stay in one place, and if you stay in one place you can have a lot more kids. And ultimately that's why the people who created civilization ultimately won out over the, I guess you could call, barbarians, who were still large, they were still hunting and gathering, they were still big, and if they would fight, they had a big advantage because they were bigger and stronger from more protein. But ultimately what won out was having more babies. And so having more babies, you know, is why we have civilization today, is because that's what eventually took. So after we have civilization, even early civilizations, some other things start to come around, like around 5,500 years ago, it seems, is when we started marking time. That seemed to be an important thing about 5,500 years ago. We started using spoons about maybe 5,000 years ago. What were some of the other things that came out? About 5,000 years ago, we started riding horseback. It seems, even in areas where they were still kind of hunter-gatherers, they were developing horseback riding. It was giving them an advantage for throwing spears and having more power. You could throw spears with more power that way, or if you're fighting with each other, you can have more power that way. And I think in Eastern Asia, there were other, what they call archaic humans wandering around, and I think there was a lot of conflict between all of those different types of humans. And so riding a horse, gave you an advantage. You could win if you're in a battle if you're riding on a horse and you throw a spear really hard that way. It's going to give you an advantage. And so that's what eventually happened. Okay, so one thing I did not cover was I wanted to talk about Kennewick Man, which is an ancient Indian that they found in North America, and they call him an Indian because he was found in North America. And Native Indians basically wanted to say that, oh, he's our people. No, not from 6,000 years ago. He was not your people. No, he was not. Oh, he spoke the same language and he had the same culture. No. 6,000 years? No. But I guarantee you the language was not the same. The culture was not the same. The religion was not the same. And even though they found that they were actually connected with DNA, which isn't really that surprising, in no other way were they similar. I guarantee it was a completely different culture with a completely different language. Okay, so basically that's what happened. And so as people started to, as religion started to get more developed, people started to create more social networks, and they started traveling in larger groups of people. And as the religious leaders now, they have a common language, and so now once they started to settle down, saying that I am the conduit, I am the connection to the gods, that gave their leadership more legitimacy, they had more power, more authority that way. And that was really sort of how religion, or civilization, I should say, started to evolve. And the earliest evidence that we have so far is about 12,000 years ago, because it goes even further back than Göbekli Tepe. But it's also still in southern Turkey. Those seem to be the first civilizations. The first really successful civilization was Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq, and then not long after that, the Indus Valley. All right, and so that brings us through the time period of those 28,000 years, from like 40,000 years ago up to about 12,000 years ago, or about 10,000 BC, and that's where we'll leave off for this episode. And again, thank you for joining me. If you like these episodes, remember to share, subscribe, like, do all those things, and hopefully we'll see you for the next episode. I'm Scott Houston. This was Learning with Power. We'll see you next time.